Welcome back to our AI-powered rewrite of Game of Thrones Season 8, the ending that fans truly deserved. In our previous episodes, we've witnessed the epic battle for Dorne, where the Night King fell through teamwork rather than plot armor, seen Jon's true parentage unite him with Daenerys instead of driving them apart, and watched as Sansa's political brilliance secured northern independence. The siege of King's Landing delivered devastating action as dragon fire rained down on the Golden Company. Jorah Mormont made the ultimate sacrifice, and the city's walls finally fell. But Episode 4 brought us the climactic confrontation with true madness. Cersei's wildfire trap threatened to destroy the entire city, forcing Jaime to make the ultimate choice between family loyalty and innocent lives. The Clegane brothers settled their lifelong hatred in brutal combat, while Arya witnessed the Hound's final redemption. Jon and Daenerys descended into hell itself, their combined ice and fire powers stopping the wildfire reaction and melting the Iron Throne into a crown of ashes. Justice was served at Dragonstone as war criminals faced judgment. Mercy was granted to those who deserved it, and it seemed like peace was finally within reach. But just as our heroes celebrated their hard-won victory, a raven arrived with news that shattered everything. A massive fleet of unknown ships approaches from the Far East, carrying threats from beyond the known world. Ancient powers that have been waiting centuries for their moment of revenge are finally making their move. Today in Episode 5, The Dragon's Choice, we discover that the Game of Thrones was only the beginning. Now our heroes must face enemies who possess knowledge and power that stretches back to the very foundations of their world, and the choices they make will determine not just who rules Westeros, but whether Westeros will survive at all. Chapter 31, The Slave Master's Revenge. The Great Hall of Dragonstone had been transformed into a war room within hours of receiving the dire news from the east. Maps covered every available surface, their edges weighed down with goblets and daggers as Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, and their advisors worked to understand the magnitude of the threat approaching their shores. The victory over Cersei, which had seemed so complete just days before, now felt hollow and insufficient in the face of this new crisis. Daenerys stood before the great hearth, her violet eyes reflecting the firelight as she studied reports that had been arriving throughout the night. Ravens from across the Seven Kingdoms brought fragments of information, pieces of a puzzle that grew more terrifying with each new detail. The fleet that approached was not merely large, it was unprecedented. More ships than had ever been assembled in recorded history, carrying forces that seemed to emerge from legend itself. The reports from Slavers Bay were particularly disturbing. Meereen, the crown jewel of her liberation campaign, was under siege by a coalition of forces that defied easy categorization. Former masters who should have been broken and scattered had somehow found new backing, new weapons, new purpose, but behind them stood powers that even her most knowledgeable advisors struggled to identify. Tyrion Lannister paced before the great table, his mind working through the implications of each new piece of intelligence. "The timing cannot be coincidental," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation that filled the hall. "They waited until we were fully committed to the war in Westeros, until our forces were scattered and our attention divided. This has been planned for years, possibly decades." Jon felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him like a physical force. The king in the north had thought the wars were over, had allowed himself to believe that peace might finally be possible. Now he faced the prospect of a conflict that could dwarf everything that had come before, a war that would test not just their military capabilities, but their very understanding of the world. Sam Tarly approached the table carrying a collection of ancient texts, his scholarly instincts having led him to research everything the Citadel's library contained about the far eastern kingdoms. What he had found was fragmentary and often contradictory, but it painted a picture of civilizations far older and more sophisticated than most Westerosi imagined. "Yaite," he said. spreading an ancient map across the table. The Golden Empire of the Dawn. Their histories speak of power that predates even old Valyria, of knowledge preserved from the earliest days of human civilization. If they have truly allied with the remnants of the slave masters, then we're facing more than just a military threat. Daenerys turned from the fire, her expression hardening as she processed this information. The Dragon Queen had spent years fighting slavery in its various forms, had believed that her victories in Slaver's Bay represented the beginning of its end. The thought that those same forces had found new allies, new sources of power, was both personally and politically devastating. "What do they want?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Varys stepped forward from his position near the window, his network of informants having provided him with fragments of intelligence that painted a disturbing picture. "Revenge, Your Grace. The liberation of Slaver's Bay disrupted trade networks that had existed for millennia. Fortunes built over centuries were destroyed. Power structures that had seemed eternal were shattered. They want their world back." The spy master's words carried the weight of years spent understanding the complex web of relationships that bound the known world together. The abolition of slavery had been more than a moral victory. It had been an economic revolution that had sent shockwaves across continents. Those who had profited from human bondage had not simply accepted their losses and moved on. Grey Worm spoke from his position near the door, his scarred face reflecting the internal struggle between duty and desire for vengeance. "The Unsullied in Meereen sent word before the siege began," he reported. "The attackers use weapons and tactics unknown to us. They have creatures that fly, but are not dragons, ships that move without wind or oars. This is not merely an alliance of former masters seeking restoration." The implications were staggering. If the Eastern powers possessed technology or abilities that surpassed even what dragons could achieve, then the military advantages that had secured Daenerys' victories might prove insufficient. The game had changed, and they were playing by rules they didn't fully understand. Missandei, still bearing the physical and emotional scars of her recent captivity, offered insights that chilled them all. "In Slaver's Bay there were always rumors of powers beyond the Jade Sea," she said quietly. "Masters who claimed to serve beings older than dragons, knowledge that came from the Shadowlands and places even further east. Most dismissed these as stories meant to frighten slaves into submission." Her words carried the authority of someone who had lived within the system they now fought against, who had seen its cruelties and complexities from the inside. If the rumors she had heard were true, then they were facing opponents who possessed advantages that went beyond mere military superiority. Jorah Mormont's absence was keenly felt as they discussed strategy. The old knight's experience in Essos would have been invaluable, his understanding of the political and cultural landscape crucial to their planning. But he was gone, another casualty of the wars that had brought them to this point, and they would have to find their way without his guidance. Davos Seaworth studied the nautical charts with the eye of someone who had spent a lifetime at sea. "The numbers don't make sense," he observed. "No kingdom, no matter how wealthy, could support a fleet of this size. The logistics alone would be staggering. They're getting support from sources we haven't identified." It was a disturbing observation that highlighted how little they truly knew about their new enemies. The Seven Kingdoms had always been the center of their world, with everything else existing on the periphery of their attention. Now they were discovering that there were powers beyond their borders that rivaled or exceeded their own capabilities. Daenerys moved to the great window that looked out over the narrow sea, her dragons visible in the distance as they patrolled the waters around Dragonstone. Through her connection with them, she could sense their unease, their instinctive recognition that something ancient and hostile was approaching. "We have advantages they cannot match," she said, turning back to the assembled council. "Dragons are unique, irreplaceable. Whatever creatures they bring, Whatever weapons they possess, they cannot replicate the bond between dragon and rider that has been the foundation of our power. But even as she spoke, they all understood that dragons alone might not be sufficient. The Eastern powers had clearly studied their campaigns, had observed their tactics and capabilities. They would not have committed to this massive undertaking without believing they had the means to counter the advantages that dragons provided. Jon joined her at the window, his gray eyes scanning the horizon as if he could somehow see the approaching threat. "We need more information," he said. "We're making plans based on rumors and fragments. If we're going to fight them, we need to understand what we're truly facing." The discussion that followed was both practical and philosophical. They needed to prepare for military conflict while simultaneously trying to understand opponents whose motivations and capabilities remained largely mysterious. The scattered reports suggested a coalition of forces that spanned continents, united by shared grievance against the changes that Daenerys' liberation campaigns had brought to their world. Tyrion raised the question that haunted them all. "Do we fight them in the east or wait for them to come to us?" he asked. "Each choice carries enormous risks, but we have to choose one or the other." It was a decision that would define not just their strategy, but their legacy. Fighting in Essos would mean abandoning the 7 kingdoms they had just unified, leaving their newly established rule vulnerable to internal challenges. But waiting for the enemy to arrive would give them time to prepare, while potentially allowing the destruction of everything Daenerys had built in Slavers Bay. The debate continued throughout the night, with various options proposed and evaluated. Some favored an immediate return to Essos, arguing that their enemies would be weaker if confronted on familiar ground. Others insisted that their primary obligation was to the kingdom they now ruled, that Westeros could not be left undefended while they fought distant wars. As dawn approached, no final decision had been reached, but the framework for future action was becoming clear. This would not be a conventional war, fought between armies according to established rules. This would be a clash between different visions of what the world should be, between those who sought to preserve ancient systems of oppression and those who believed in the possibility of something better. The slave master's revenge had begun, but it was more than mere revenge. It was an attempt to turn back the clock of history, to restore a world order that had seemed destined for extinction. The question that remained was whether love and justice would prove stronger than hatred and greed, whether the future could triumph over the weight of the past. The dragons circled overhead, their shadows passing over the castle like omens of the struggles to come. The Game of Thrones was over, but a far greater game was just beginning. Chapter 32. The Choice of Queens. The private chambers of Dragonstone had become a sanctuary of sorts, a place where Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen could speak freely without the weight of advisors and courtiers pressing in on every word. The morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the stone floor as they grappled with a decision that would determine the fate of 2 continents. Daenerys stood before the great mirror that had once belonged to Aegon the Conqueror, her reflection showing a woman transformed by recent events. The silver hair that had once marked her as different now seemed to glow within a fire, and her violet eyes carried the weight of someone who had looked into the heart of destruction and emerged stronger. But beneath the strength lay uncertainty, the terrible burden of choosing between competing loyalties and responsibilities. "They're calling it the Great Liberation," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber to where Jon sat, studying reports from their scouts. "That's what the freed slaves of Meereen named our campaign. They see it as the beginning of a new age, the dawn of a world where no one need live in chains." Jon looked up from the documents, his gray eyes reflecting the same internal struggle that marked her features. The king in the north understood the weight of legacy, the responsibility that came with being remembered not just as a ruler, but as someone who had changed the fundamental nature of their world. "And now it's all at risk," he said, quietly. The reports scattered across the table painted a grim picture of the situation in Slavers Bay. Meereen was under siege by forces that seemed to have emerged from the deepest nightmares of history. The coalition arrayed against the city was more than just former masters seeking revenge. It was a gathering of powers that had remained hidden in the shadows for generations, waiting for their moment to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Daenerys moved away from the mirror, her steps carrying her to the window that looked out over the narrow sea. In the distance her dragons circled in the morning air, their forms dark against the brightening sky. Through her bond with them she could feel their restlessness, their instinctive understanding that their mother faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives. "Tyrion believes we should stay," she said, her fingers tracing patterns on the cool stone of the windowsill. "He argues that our primary responsibility is to the Seven Kingdoms, that we cannot abandon the realm we've just unified to fight distant wars. There's wisdom in his words." Jon rose from his chair and approached her, his presence bringing comfort even in the midst of their impossible dilemma. "But your heart tells you otherwise," he observed, his voice carrying the understanding that came from months of shared struggle and growing intimacy. "My heart tells me that the children I freed in Meereen deserve the same protection I would give to the children of Winterfell," Daenerys replied. "That the slaves who believed in my promise of liberation have just as much claim to my loyalty as the lords who bend the knee in King's Landing." It was the fundamental tension that had defined her entire campaign, the conflict between personal desire and public duty. Daenerys had never wanted to be a conqueror in the traditional sense. She had wanted to be a liberator, someone who broke chains rather than forged them. The thought of abandoning that mission for the sake of political convenience was almost unbearable. Jon placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling the tension in her muscles as she wrestled with the decision. "What does Missandei counsel?" he asked, knowing that the former slave's perspective would carry unique weight in their deliberations. "She says I should go," Daenerys answered, "not as a queen seeking to expand her domain, but as someone honoring a sacred promise. The freed slaves of Essos believed in something when they followed me, believed that the world could be different. If I abandon them now, what does that say about the value of that belief?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. They had both learned that leadership meant making choices that had consequences far beyond their immediate circle, that decisions made in private chambers could echo through history. The weight of those consequences was almost crushing in its magnitude. Through the window they could see ravens arriving and departing with increasing frequency, carrying messages that would help shape their understanding of the situation. Each bird brought new intelligence, new complications, new factors that had to be considered in their calculations. The world had become suddenly complex in ways that neither had anticipated when they first set out to reclaim the Iron Throne. "There's something else," Jon said, his voice carrying a note of concern that made Daenerys turn to face him fully. "The reports from the East speak of weapons and tactics that we don't understand. If these powers have been preparing for this moment as long as our advisors believe, then they may have capabilities that even dragons cannot overcome." It was a sobering thought, one that challenged the fundamental assumptions on which their military strategy had been based. Dragons had been the decisive factor in every major victory of Daenerys' campaign, from the liberation of Slavers Bay to the conquest of Westeros. If their enemies possessed the means to neutralize that advantage, then everything changed. "Then we adapt," Daenerys said, her voice carrying the steel that had sustained her through years of exile and struggle. "We learn, we change our tactics. We find new ways to achieve our goals. That's what separates conquerors from liberators. Conquerors impose their will through force. Liberators inspire others to fight for themselves." The distinction was more than semantic. It represented a fundamental difference in approach that would determine not just their strategy, but their legacy. Jon understood this better than most, having seen how the people of the North had responded to leadership that served their interests rather than demanding their service. A knock at the chamber door interrupted their discussion, followed by the entrance of Grey Worm, carrying news that would crystallize their decision. The unsullied commander's scarred face bore an expression of controlled urgency as he approached with a message that had just arrived from across the narrow sea. From Dasario Naharis, he reported, referring to the sellsword captain who had remained in Meereen to help maintain order after Daenerys' departure. The siege has intensified. The enemy brings creatures that fly but are not birds, ships that sail against the wind, weapons that strike from impossible distances. The city's defenses are holding, but they will not hold forever. The news struck both rulers like a physical blow. Daenario was not given to exaggeration or panic. If he said the situation was desperate, then it truly was. The forces arrayed against Meereen represented a threat that went beyond conventional warfare, touching on powers and abilities that challenged their understanding of what was possible. "How long?" Daenerys asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Weeks, perhaps less, if the enemy commits their full strength," Grey Worm replied. "But there is hope. The freed slaves fight with the fury of those who remember what slavery was like. They know what defeat would mean for their children, for their future. They will not surrender easily." The image conjured by his words was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Men and women who had once known only bondage were now willing to die rather than return to chains. They had tasted freedom and found it worth any sacrifice to preserve. How could anyone who claimed to care about justice abandon such courage? Jon felt the weight of decisions settling on them both like a physical force. They had perhaps days to choose between staying in Westeros to consolidate their rule or returning to Essos to honor their commitments to the freed slaves. Either choice would have consequences that would echo through generations. "There's a third option," he said slowly, his mind working through possibilities that had only just occurred to him. "We don't have to choose one or the other. We can divide our attention, our resources, our presence." Daenerys turned to study his face, seeing the kernel of an idea that might resolve their impossible dilemma. "Shared rule," she said, understanding dawning in her voice. Not just in Westeros, but across both continents. It was an unprecedented concept, the idea of a monarchy that spanned the known world while still respecting local autonomy and customs. It would require a fundamental reimagining of what kingship and queenship meant, a transformation from the traditional model of central authority to something more flexible and responsive. "You would rule in Westeros, while I return to Essos," Daenerys continued, working through the implications. "We maintain unity of purpose, while allowing each realm to develop according to its own needs and character." The plan was audacious, challenging every assumption about how power should be structured and exercised. But it also offered a way to honor their commitments to both continents while maximizing their effectiveness as leaders. They could be together in spirit and purpose while remaining physically separate when duty demanded it. Grey Worm listened to their discussion with growing understanding, his tactical mind already working through the military implications of such an arrangement. The dragons could serve both realms, he observed, rotating between continents as needed, providing support where the threat was greatest. It was a logistical challenge that would require careful coordination and unprecedented trust between rulers who would often be separated by vast distances. But it was also an opportunity to demonstrate that love could transcend physical proximity, that true partnership could survive even the demands of continental leadership. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt both inevitable and revolutionary. They would rule together by ruling apart, honoring their commitments to both the Seven Kingdoms and the freed slaves of Essos. It was a choice that reflected their growth as leaders and as partners, their understanding that sometimes the greatest strength came from the willingness to trust each other completely. The choice of queens had been made, but it was also the choice of kings, of dragons, and of everyone who believed that the world could be better than it was. Chapter 33 Two Thrones. The great courtyard of Dragonstone had been transformed into something unprecedented in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Where once Aegon the Conqueror had planned his invasion of Westeros, now his descendants prepared to establish a new form of rule that would span continents and challenge every assumption about the nature of monarchy. Banners from across the realm fluttered in the sea breeze, but they were joined by others bearing symbols from Essos, representing the freed cities that had pledged their allegiance to Daenerys Targaryen's vision of liberation. The ceremony that was about to unfold would mark more than just a coronation. It would represent the birth of a new kind of empire, one built not on conquest and domination, but on cooperation and shared values. Jon Snow stood at one end of the great platform that had been erected in the center of the courtyard, his simple steel crown catching the morning light. Beside him, Daenerys Targaryen wore the colors of her house, but her crown bore symbols from both Westeros and Essos, representing the dual nature of the realm she would help govern. Tyrion Lannister stood between them, the scroll in his hands containing words that had never before been spoken in any coronation ceremony. The hand of the Queen had worked through the night with maesters and scholars to craft language that would capture the unprecedented nature of what they were attempting to create. This was not just the crowning of new rulers, but the formal establishment of a governmental structure that defied traditional categories. "Lords and ladies of the Seven Kingdoms," Tyrion began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "We gather today to witness something that has never before been seen in the annals of history. Not the coronation of a king and queen who rule from a single throne, but the establishment of a dual monarchy that will serve both the needs of Westeros and the liberated peoples of Essos." The crowd that filled the courtyard represented a cross-section of the known world. Northern lords stood beside Dothraki cowls, former slaves from Slavers Bay mingled with knights from the Vale, and merchants from the free cities shared space with maesters from the Citadel. It was a gathering that would have been impossible to imagine just months before, when the Seven Kingdoms were still locked in civil war, and the eastern and western continents remained largely separate spheres. Sansa Stark watched from her place among the northern delegation, her blue eyes reflecting both pride and concern, as she observed her brother accept responsibilities that would transform him from the bastard of Winterfell into one of the most powerful rulers in the known world. The Queen in the north understood better than most the weight of the crown, the way that power could both elevate and isolate those who wielded it. But she also understood that Jon's fundamental nature, his commitment to duty and service, would help him navigate the challenges ahead. "Jon Snow, called Aegon Targaryen," Tyrion continued, "do you swear to rule the Seven Kingdoms with wisdom and justice, to protect the innocent and serve the common good, and to maintain the bonds of unity that have been forged through shared struggle and sacrifice?" Jon's response came without hesitation, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had marked his leadership throughout the wars that had brought them to this point. "I swear it before gods and men, before the living and the memory of the dead. I will serve the realm with honor, protect those who cannot protect themselves, and work to build a kingdom where justice is not the privilege of the few but the right of all." The words were simple, but their implications were profound. This was not a traditional oath of kingship, focused on maintaining existing power structures and extracting obedience from subjects. This was a commitment to service, a promise to use power as a tool for positive change rather than personal aggrandizement. Daenerys stepped forward as Tyrion turned to address her, her silver hair streaming in the wind that came off the narrow sea. Through her bond with her dragons, she could feel their presence circling high above the ceremony, their ancient voices adding a note of otherworldly solemnity to the proceedings. "Daenerys Targaryen, breaker of chains, mother of dragons," Tyrion said, his voice carrying the weight of the titles she had earned through years of struggle and sacrifice. "Do you swear to rule with wisdom and compassion, to protect the liberated peoples of Essos and continue the great work of ending slavery in all its forms, while maintaining unity of purpose with your partner in the Seven Kingdoms?" Her response carried the fire that had sustained her through exile, slavery, and war. But it was tempered now with the wisdom that had come from hard-won experience. I swear it by fire and blood, by the bonds of love that unite us all. I will protect those who have been freed, and work to free those who still suffer. I will rule not through fear but through hope, not through domination but through inspiration. The ceremony continued with oaths from the great lords and representatives of the various factions that would support this new form of government. Lord Royce spoke for the Vale, pledging continued loyalty to the crown while maintaining the regional autonomy that had proven so effective in the north. Representatives from the free cities swore allegiance to Daenerys while committing their resources to the common defense against the threats emerging from the Far East. Perhaps most significantly, Grey Worm stepped forward to speak on behalf of the Unsullied and the freed slaves of Slavers Bay. His scarred face bore an expression of solemn pride as he addressed the assembled crowd, his words carrying the weight of someone who had experienced both bondage and liberation. "We who were made to be weapons have learned to be men," he said, his accented voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "We who knew only slavery have tasted freedom and found it worth any sacrifice to preserve. We pledge our loyalty not to rulers who demand obedience, but to leaders who have earned our trust through their actions." The distinction was crucial, representing the philosophical foundation on which the new government would be built. This would not be a monarchy based on divine right or inherited privilege, but a partnership between rulers and ruled based on mutual respect and shared goals. Sam Tarly approached the platform, carrying 2 crowns that had been specially crafted for this occasion. Neither was the elaborate golden construction that had traditionally marked royal power. Instead, they were simple circlets of Valyrian steel, inscribed with symbols representing both the old gods and the new, the 7 kingdoms and the liberated cities of Essos. "These crowns are forged from the steel of swords," Sam announced, his voice carrying the authority of his scholarship. "Not swords taken in conquest, but swords willingly surrendered by those who chose peace over war. They represent not the power to command, but the responsibility to serve." The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. The weapons of war had been transformed into symbols of peace, just as the institution of monarchy was being transformed from an instrument of oppression into a tool for liberation and justice. Jon accepted his crown with the same quiet dignity that had marked all his actions, feeling its weight as both a physical object and a representation of the responsibilities he was accepting. This was not just a personal honor, but a sacred trust, a commitment to use whatever power he possessed in service of something greater than himself. Daenerys received her crown with a sense of coming full circle, remembering the girl who had been sold into marriage to a Dothraki Khal and comparing her to the woman who now stood ready to rule half the known world. The journey had been long and painful, marked by loss and struggle, but it had led to this moment of triumph and hope. The formal ceremony concluded with the reading of the Charter of Dual Rule, a document that would establish the legal and political framework for their unprecedented form of government. The Charter outlined the division of responsibilities between the 2 monarchs, the mechanisms for coordination and communication, and the principles that would guide their decision-making. Most importantly, the Charter established that this would be a government of laws rather than personalities, a system that could survive the inevitable changes that time would bring. Future rulers would be bound by the same commitments to justice and service, ensuring that the transformation they were beginning would outlast any individual reign. As the ceremony drew to a close, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard across the narrow sea. This was not just the celebration of new rulers, but the birth of new hope, the promise that the future could be better than the past if people were willing to work together toward common goals. The dragons circled overhead, their voices joining the human celebration with roars that seemed to shake the very foundations of Dragonstone. Through her bond with them, Daenerys could feel their approval, their understanding that this moment represented something unique and precious in the history of their world. Jon and Daenerys stood together for a moment, their hands joined as they looked out over the crowd that had witnessed their transformation from exiles and bastards into the founders of a new age. The path ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and obstacles that they could not yet imagine, but they would face those challenges together, united in purpose even when separated by distance. The two thrones they would occupy were not seats of dominance but platforms for service, not symbols of power but reminders of responsibility. And from those thrones they would work to build a world where freedom was not a privilege to be granted but a right to be protected, where justice was not the exception but the rule. The coronation was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The age of dual rule had dawned, and with it, the hope that love could triumph over hatred, that cooperation could overcome conflict, and that the future could be shaped by those brave enough to dream of something better. Chapter 34. The Eastern Campaign. The harbor of Dragonstone had become a scene of controlled chaos as the greatest fleet ever assembled in Westerosi waters prepared for departure. Ships of every size and description crowded the anchorage, from great war galleys to swift messenger vessels, all bearing the dragon banner of House Targaryen alongside the Wolf of Stark. The sight would have been magnificent under different circumstances, but the urgency that drove these preparations cast a shadow over what should have been a moment of triumph. Daenerys Targaryen stood on the deck of her flagship, watching as the final supplies were loaded into the holds of ships that would carry her back to the continent, where her transformation from exile to queen had begun. The Dragon Queen wore practical armor rather than royal regalia, understanding that the campaign ahead would be measured not in ceremonial appearances, but in the hard mathematics of warfare. Her silver hair was bound back in the style she had favored during her conquests in Slaver's Bay, a reminder of the woman she had been before the Iron Throne had complicated her mission. The fleet that surrounded her represented more than just military might. It was a statement of purpose that would be understood across the known world. The Unsullied filled dozens of transport vessels, their disciplined ranks, a testament to the professional approach that would characterize this campaign. The surviving Dothraki occupied their own ships, their horses secured in specially constructed holds that would allow them to bring their mobility to bear against the enemies waiting in Essos. But perhaps most significantly, the fleet carried representatives from across the Seven Kingdoms, volunteers who had chosen to join this campaign, not for personal gain, but out of commitment to the principles it represented. Northern knights sailed beside Riverlanders, men from the Vale shared space with warriors from Dorne, and even some from the Iron Islands had chosen to participate in this expedition to distant shores. Jon Snow stood beside Daenerys on the flagship's deck, his presence both comforting and heartbreaking. The king in the north would remain in Westeros to consolidate their rule there, but his support for her mission was absolute and unwavering. The separation that was about to begin would test their relationship in ways that battle and political crisis never had, but both understood that this division of effort was necessary for the greater good. "The dragons will be divided," Daenerys said, gesturing toward the three great beasts that circled overhead. "Drogon will come with me while Rhaegal and Viserion remain to protect Westeros. If the intelligence about Eastern capabilities is accurate, we cannot risk concentrating all our aerial power in one location." Jon nodded, understanding the strategic logic, even as he felt the emotional weight of impending separation. "How long?" he asked, the question that had haunted them both since the decision had been made. "As long as it takes," Daenerys replied, her voice carrying the determination that had sustained her through years of struggle. "The freed slaves of Meereen believed in something when they followed me. I cannot abandon them now, no matter what personal cost that abandonment might require." The conversation that followed was both practical and deeply personal, covering everything from military strategy to the mechanisms they would use to maintain communication across the vast distances that would separate them. Ravens would carry messages when possible, but they both understood that there would be periods when each would have to make crucial decisions without the benefit of the other's counsel. Grey Worm approached them, carrying reports from the scouts who had been monitoring the eastern approaches. The unsullied commander's face bore the expression of controlled concern that had marked him since learning of the threats facing Metrine and the other liberated cities. His loyalty to Daenerys was absolute, but it was tempered now by his growing attachment to Missandei and his desire to protect what they had built together. "The enemy fleet has been sighted," he reported. "Still days away, but moving faster than our most optimistic projections suggested. Whatever powers they serve, they have provided them with ships that can cover vast distances in remarkably short periods." The news added urgency to preparations that were already proceeding at breakneck pace. If the Eastern Fleet was moving more quickly than anticipated, then the window for Daenerys to reach Meereen before it fell might be narrower than they had hoped. Every hour of delay could mean the difference between arriving to break a siege and arriving to find only ruins. Tyrion Lannister climbed the gangplank to join them on the flagship's deck, his expression reflecting the complex emotions that surrounded this departure. The hand of the Queen would remain in Westeros to help Jon navigate the political complexities of ruling the Seven Kingdoms, but his expertise in both military strategy and Eastern politics would be sorely missed in the campaign ahead. "The supply situation is as good as we can make it," he reported, consulting the lists that had occupied much of his attention in recent days. "Enough provisions for 3 months of active campaigning, with arrangements for resupply from the free cities if the campaign extends longer. The financial backing is solid, with loans secured from the Iron Bank and contributions from grateful merchants who profited from the abolition of slavery." It was a reminder that this campaign had support that extended far beyond military considerations. The economic disruption caused by slavery's continuation had affected trade networks across multiple continents, creating a coalition of interests that favored decisive action against the forces seeking to restore the old order. Missandei joined the group on deck, her presence serving as a living reminder of what was at stake in the campaign ahead. The former slave had experienced both bondage and liberation, had seen firsthand what life was like under the systems that their enemies sought to restore. Her commitment to the mission was total, driven not by abstract political theory, but by personal knowledge of what slavery meant for those who suffered under it. The freed slaves in Meereen sent word through channels that most would not recognize, she said, her voice carrying information that formal intelligence networks had been unable to provide. "They are not just defending a city, they are defending the idea that people can choose their own fate. That makes them more dangerous to their enemies than any conventional army." The insight was crucial, highlighting the ideological dimension of the conflict that was about to unfold. This was not just a war between rival military forces, but a clash between competing visions of what human society should look like. The former slaves fought with the fury of those who had tasted freedom and would die rather than return to chains, while their enemies were driven by the desperation of those who saw their entire way of life threatened by change. As the morning progressed, the final preparations were completed with military efficiency that would have impressed even the most demanding commanders. Weapons were secured, provisions were distributed, and the complex logistics of moving thousands of people across vast distances were finalized. The fleet that prepared to depart represented not just military might, but organizational capability of the highest order. The moment of departure arrived with surprising suddenness. Despite all the preparation that had preceded it, Daenerys and Jon stood together at the ship's rail, their hands joined as they faced the reality of separation that would test their partnership in unprecedented ways. The love that had grown between them during their shared struggles would now have to survive the strain of distance and the uncertainty of war. "Remember that we are stronger together even when we are apart," Jon said, his words carrying the weight of a promise that transcended mere romantic sentiment. "Whatever challenges you face in Essos, you face them with the knowledge that Westeros stands behind you." Daenerys felt tears threaten, but she controlled them with the discipline that had been forged in the fires of conquest and loss. And whatever trials come to the Seven Kingdoms, you will meet them knowing that the liberated peoples of Essos consider you their king as well, she replied. The exchange of farewells was brief but deeply felt, both understanding that prolonging the moment would only make the separation more difficult. As the flagship's sails filled with wind and the great fleet began to move toward the open sea, Daenerys stood at the stern, watching Dragonstone recede into the distance. The castle that had been her refuge and base of operations was disappearing behind them, but it would remain connected to her through bonds stronger than mere geography. Drogon descended to land on the ship's specially constructed platform, his massive form adding both physical and symbolic weight to the expedition. The great black dragon seemed to understand the significance of their departure, his ancient intelligence recognizing that they were embarking on a journey that would determine the fate of millions of people across multiple continents. As the Seven Kingdoms faded behind them, and the vast expanse of the narrow sea opened ahead, Daenerys felt the familiar thrill of campaign beginning to stir in her blood. This was what she had been born for, not sitting on thrones and managing the complexities of court politics, but leading from the front in service of causes greater than herself. The Eastern Campaign had begun, but it represented more than just military action. It was a statement that the age of slavery was truly over, that those who sought to turn back the clock of history would face the full fury of those committed to human freedom. The ships that carried them toward distant shores bore not just soldiers and weapons, but the hopes of everyone who believed that the future could be better than the past. The dragon banners flew proudly in the sea wind, but they were joined now by others representing the liberated cities of Essos and the common cause that united all who fought against oppression. This would be a campaign fought not for conquest or personal glory, but for the simple principle that all people deserve to choose their own destiny. The Game of Thrones was over, but the greater game of human liberation was entering its most crucial phase, and at its head flew a queen and her dragon, carrying fire and hope in equal measure toward whatever awaited them on distant shores. Chapter 35. Rebuilding the Realm. The throne room of the Red Keep had been completely transformed in the weeks following the wildfire crisis. Where once the Iron Throne had dominated the space with its twisted metal construction, now stood a simple wooden chair surrounded by a circular table where representatives from across the Seven Kingdoms could meet as equals. The symbolism was deliberate and profound, representing the fundamental shift from autocratic rule to collaborative governance that would define Jon Snow's approach to kingship. Jon stood at the great window that looked out over King's Landing, watching the reconstruction efforts that had transformed the capital from a war-torn ruin into something resembling a functioning city once again. The scars of battle were still visible throughout the lower districts, but they were being healed through the combined efforts of thousands of people who had chosen cooperation over conflict. The sight filled him with a cautious optimism that had been rare during the long years of war. The small council that had gathered around the circular table represented a departure from tradition in more ways than one. Where previous kings had surrounded themselves with sycophants and political appointees, Jon had chosen his advisors based on competence and character rather than noble birth or personal loyalty. The result was a governing body that actually functioned rather than simply providing the appearance of consultation. Davos Seaworth occupied the position of Master of Ships, his experience as both smuggler and naval commander providing unique insights into the maritime challenges facing the realm. The Onion Knight had thrown himself into the task of rebuilding the royal fleet with the same practical efficiency that had marked all his endeavors, understanding that control of the seas would be crucial to defending against the eastern threats that loomed on the horizon. "The new ships are coming along well," he reported, consulting the documents spread before him on the table. "We're incorporating design improvements learned from studying the wreckage of Euron's fleet, combined with techniques borrowed from the Free Cities. The result should be vessels that are both faster and more heavily armed than anything we've fielded before." Santali had accepted the position of Grand Maester with characteristic reluctance, but his performance in the role had exceeded everyone's expectations. The young scholar's approach to the position emphasized practical knowledge over theoretical speculation, focusing on innovations that could improve the lives of ordinary people rather than advancing abstract academic theories. "The new healing techniques we've developed are showing remarkable results," he said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm that always marked his discussion of scholarly matters. Combining traditional Westerosi methods with knowledge gained from Essos has allowed us to treat injuries and diseases that were once considered fatal. The mortality rates in King's Landing have dropped by nearly half since we implemented these practices. Brienne of Tarth had assumed the role of Lord Commander of the King's Guard, bringing to the position a commitment to honor that had been absent from the organization for far too long. Her reforms had transformed the King's Guard from a political appointment into a genuine force for justice and protection, with members chosen based on character rather than family connections. "The new recruits are adapting well to the changes," she reported with satisfaction. "We've established training programs that emphasize protection of the innocent over personal combat prowess. The goal is to create knights who see their role as service to the realm rather than service to a particular ruler." The transformation of the King's Guard reflected the broader changes taking place throughout the government. Where once positions of authority had been awarded as political favors, they were now filled by people who had demonstrated their commitment to the common good. It was a revolutionary approach that was beginning to show results in improved efficiency and reduced corruption. Podrick Payne, who had been elevated to full knighthood for his service during the recent wars, served as Brienne's deputy and representative of the new generation of leaders emerging throughout the realm. His advancement from squire to knight to royal advisor represented the kind of merit-based promotion that Jon was trying to establish as the norm rather than the exception. "The regional lords are responding well to the new policies," he reported, his voice carrying more confidence than it had in the early days of his service. "The emphasis on local autonomy while maintaining central coordination is allowing each kingdom to address its specific challenges while contributing to the common defense." The approach Jon had adopted drew heavily on the lessons learned from Sansa's successful governance of the North. Rather than trying to impose uniform solutions across diverse regions, his administration worked to establish common principles while allowing local implementation to vary according to specific circumstances and needs. Arya Stark's return to Westeros had been temporary but significant, her experiences exploring the lands beyond the sunset, providing valuable intelligence about potential allies and threats that might emerge from unexpected directions. Though she had departed again on her own adventures, her reports had helped shape the strategic thinking that guided the realm's defensive preparations. The economic recovery that was underway represented perhaps the most visible success of the new approach to governance. Trade networks that had been disrupted by years of civil war were being rebuilt with improvements that made them more resilient and equitable. The elimination of many traditional tariffs and trade barriers had stimulated commerce while generating revenue through more efficient taxation systems. Gendry Baratheon had proven himself to be an effective Lord of Storm's End, his practical background as a blacksmith providing him with insights into the real needs of working people that many highborn lords lacked. His success in restoring prosperity to the Stormlands had become a model that other regions sought to emulate. "The agricultural improvements we've implemented are showing remarkable results," he reported during one of his visits to the capital. "New farming techniques learned from across the Narrow Sea are increasing crop yields while reducing the labor required. The result is better food security and more people available for other kinds of work." The integration of knowledge from Essos represented one of the most significant changes in how the Seven Kingdoms approached governance. Rather than viewing the Eastern continent as a source of exotic luxury goods, it was now seen as a repository of practical knowledge that could benefit everyone. This shift in perspective had led to innovations in everything from architecture to medicine to agriculture. The correspondence that flowed between Westeros and Essos provided a constant reminder that Jon and Daenerys were ruling as partners despite their physical separation. Ravens carried not just official communications, but personal letters that maintained the emotional bond between the two rulers, even across vast distances. The relationship that had begun in war was proving strong enough to survive the challenges of peace. The reports from the Eastern Campaign were mixed but generally encouraging. Daenerys had reached Meereen in time to break the siege, but the enemy forces had proven more formidable than initially anticipated. The war that was unfolding in Slavers Bay would clearly be a protracted affair requiring sustained commitment and resources from both continents. Jon found himself constantly balancing the needs of domestic reconstruction against the demands of supporting the Eastern Campaign. Every ship sent to aid Daenerys was a ship that could not be used for trade or coastal defense. Every soldier who volunteered for service in Essos was a person who could not contribute to rebuilding efforts at home. But he understood that these were not competing priorities but complementary aspects of the same larger mission. The transformation of King's Landing itself provided daily evidence of what could be accomplished when people worked together toward common goals. The city that had been scarred by wildfire and warfare was being rebuilt with improvements that made it more livable and more defensible. New districts were being planned with broader streets and better sanitation, while existing areas were being upgraded with innovations that improved quality of life for residents at every social level. The Great Sept of Baelor, destroyed by Cersei's wildfire years earlier, was being rebuilt as an interfaith center that welcomed worshippers of all denominations. The new structure would house not just the faith of the Seven, but also godswoods for those who followed the old gods, along with spaces for the various religious traditions that had come to Westeros with immigrants from Essos. Perhaps most importantly, the new approach to governance was beginning to change how people thought about their relationship to authority. Rather than seeing themselves as subjects whose duty was to obey, citizens were encouraged to view themselves as participants in a shared enterprise. The result was a level of civic engagement that had been absent from Westerosi politics for generations. The challenges that lay ahead were significant and diverse. The eastern threats continued to loom on the horizon, while domestic issues required constant attention and resources, but the foundation that was being built seemed strong enough to support whatever weight the future might place upon it. Jon stood once again at the great window, watching the sun set over the city he now ruled. The crown he wore felt less like a burden and more like a tool, an instrument that could be used to shape the world in positive ways if wielded with wisdom and restraint. The Game of Thrones was over, but the more important game of building a better world was well underway. Chapter 36: The Stark Restoration. The Great Hall of Winterfell had been rebuilt with painstaking attention to detail. Every stone placed with reverence for the history it represented and hope for the future it would witness. Sansa Stark stood before the massive hearth where her ancestors had held court for thousands of years, but the woman who now bore the title Queen in the North was fundamentally different from the naive girl who had once dreamed of songs and southern courts. The crown she wore was simple steel rather than gold, its design echoing the practical nature of northern leadership. The renovation of Winterfell had become symbolic of the broader restoration taking place throughout the north. Where once the castle had been a fortress designed primarily for defense, it was being transformed into a center of learning and governance that could serve the needs of a people finally free to determine their own destiny. The changes were subtle but significant, reflecting the evolution from a feudal society to something more collaborative and responsive to the needs of ordinary citizens. The Bran Stark occupied a position that defied easy categorization, serving as something between royal advisor and mystical guide. The three-eyed raven's unique abilities provided insights that conventional counsel could not match, but his role was carefully structured to avoid the kind of dependency that had characterized relationships with prophets and seers in the past. His visions were treated as one source of information among many, valuable but not decisive in their own right. "The patterns are shifting," he said, his pale eyes seeming to look through the stone walls of the hall to perceive realities that existed beyond normal human perception. "The old ways of thinking about power and authority are giving way to something new, but the transformation is not without its dangers." The observation was characteristic of Brand's contributions to governing discussions. His insights were often cryptic, but consistently valuable, providing perspective that helped the living navigate challenges that purely mortal intelligence might miss. The balance between relying on his abilities and maintaining human agency was delicate but essential to the kind of leadership Sansa sought to provide. The Northern Lords who gathered regularly in Winterfell's Great Hall represented a new generation of leadership that had emerged from the crucible of recent conflicts. Many of the great houses had lost their traditional leaders during the wars, creating opportunities for younger, more progressive voices to assume positions of authority. The result was a governing council that was more diverse and more responsive to changing circumstances than its predecessors. Lord Manderley of White Harbor had embraced the new economic opportunities created by increased trade with the southern kingdoms and across the narrow sea. His port city had become a hub for commerce that connected the north to markets that had previously been largely inaccessible, generating wealth that could be invested in infrastructure and social improvements throughout the region. "The new shipping routes are exceeding all projections," he reported with satisfaction. "Northern lumber and furs are finding eager buyers in Essos, while we're importing goods and knowledge that are transforming how our people live and work. The prosperity this trade generates is being shared more equitably than ever before." Lady Mormont, who had assumed leadership of Bear Island after her cousin Lyanna's heroic death, brought to her role the same fierce determination that had characterized her predecessor. But her approach to leadership reflected lessons learned from recent conflicts, emphasizing preparation and cooperation over the kind of heroic individualism that had defined earlier generations. "Our defenses are stronger than they have ever been," she reported. "But more importantly, our people understand that their security depends not just on walls and weapons, but on the bonds of community that unite us all. Every village, every farm, every fishing boat is part of a larger network of mutual support and protection." The integration of wildling communities south of the Wall represented one of the most significant social transformations taking place in the north. The former enemies had become valued citizens, their knowledge of survival in harsh conditions proving invaluable as climate and economic circumstances continued to evolve. The cultural exchange that resulted from this integration had enriched northern society in ways that went far beyond mere population increase. Tormund's surviving followers had established new settlements throughout the north, their presence serving as a reminder that identity was not fixed but could evolve through mutual respect and shared experience. The children growing up in these communities would be neither traditional northerners nor wildlings, but something new shaped by the best aspects of both cultures. The role of women in northern society had undergone particularly dramatic changes, with Sansa's queenship serving as both symbol and catalyst for broader transformations. Female voices were now heard in councils that had previously been exclusively male domains, while traditional gender roles were being questioned and modified to better serve contemporary needs. Alysanne Mormont had established training programs that prepared young women for roles in governance, military leadership, and specialized trades that had previously been closed to them. The results were visible throughout the north, where female administrators, soldiers, and craftspeople were contributing to the region's prosperity and security in unprecedented ways. "We're not trying to eliminate traditional roles," she explained during one of her visits to Winterfell. "We're expanding the range of choices available to everyone, male and female alike. The goal is to ensure that talent and dedication are rewarded, regardless of the accidents of birth that have historically determined people's opportunities." The educational reforms that Sansa had implemented drew heavily on her own experiences and those of her siblings. The curriculum in northern schools now included not just traditional subjects like swordplay and household management, but also literacy, mathematics, history, and practical skills that would prepare students for the complexities of modern life. Sam Tarly's influence was particularly evident in these educational innovations. His correspondence with Winterfell's new maester provided access to the latest developments in scholarship and pedagogy, ensuring that northern students would be prepared to compete with their counterparts from more traditionally learned regions. The religious tolerance that characterized the New North represented another significant departure from historical patterns. While the old gods remained the primary spiritual tradition for most Northerners, the region now welcomed practitioners of the faith of the Seven, devotees of R'hllor, and followers of other traditions that had arrived with refugees and immigrants from across the known world. The Godswood of Winterfell had been expanded to include spaces for meditation and worship that accommodated various spiritual practices, while maintaining the ancient heart tree that had served the Stark family for millennia. The result was a sacred space that honored tradition while embracing diversity, reflecting the broader values that Sansa sought to instill throughout her realm. The economic prosperity that was spreading throughout the North was being managed with careful attention to sustainability and equity. Rather than allowing wealth to concentrate in the hands of a few great houses, policies were implemented to ensure that the benefits of increased trade and productivity were shared broadly across society. New industries were being developed that took advantage of northern resources and expertise while providing employment opportunities for people at every social level. Lumber mills, fur processing facilities, and metalworking shops were creating jobs that allowed ordinary citizens to participate in the region's growing prosperity. The reconstruction of the North's infrastructure represented one of the most visible symbols of the region's renewal. Roads that had been damaged or neglected during years of warfare were being rebuilt to higher standards, while new bridges and harbors were constructed to facilitate trade and communication. The castle forging techniques that had been used to build Winterfell's walls were being applied to civilian construction projects throughout the North, creating buildings that were both more durable and more comfortable than their predecessors. The result was a building boom that provided employment while improving living conditions for thousands of families. Perhaps most importantly, the sense of hope that pervaded northern society represented a fundamental shift from the defensive mindset that had characterized the region for centuries. Rather than simply trying to survive in a harsh environment, Northerners were beginning to see themselves as active participants in shaping a better future for their children and grandchildren. The correspondence that flowed between Winterfell and King's Landing reflected the strong bonds that united the Stark siblings despite their different roles and responsibilities. Jon's reports from the capital provided insights into the challenges of ruling the Seven Kingdoms, while Sansa's experiences offered valuable lessons about the practical implementation of progressive policies at the regional level. The success of northern independence within the larger framework of the Seven Kingdoms had become a model that other regions sought to emulate. The balance between local autonomy and national unity that Sansa had negotiated was proving sustainable and beneficial, creating prosperity and security that served everyone's interests. As winter gradually gave way to spring, the symbolic significance of the seasonal change was not lost on anyone who witnessed the transformation of the North. The long night of warfare and suffering was ending, replaced by the dawn of a new age characterized by hope, cooperation, and shared prosperity. The Stark restoration was complete, not just in terms of political power, but in the deeper sense of values and identity that defined what it meant to be Northern. The pack had survived, had grown stronger through adversity, and was now thriving in ways that honored both ancient traditions and contemporary needs. The wolves were home, and they intended to stay. Chapter 37. Jaime's Redemption. The courtyard of Dragonstone had been transformed into a place of solemn ceremony, its ancient stones bearing witness to an event that would have been unimaginable just months before. Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, the man who had pushed a child from a tower and killed his sworn king, stood before a tribunal that would determine not just his fate, but the meaning of redemption itself. The golden armor that had once marked his arrogance was gone, replaced by simple clothes that emphasized his humanity rather than his status. Jon Snow presided over the proceedings with the quiet authority that had marked all his leadership, understanding that the decisions made here would establish precedents for how justice and mercy would be balanced in the new order. The king in the north had personally witnessed Jaime's transformation, had seen the moment when family loyalty gave way to moral duty in the heart of the Red Keep. That witness testimony would be crucial to the outcome of this trial. Tyrion Lannister sat at the edge of the assembly, his face reflecting the complex emotions that surrounded his brother's fate. The Hand of the Queen had recused himself from formal participation in the proceedings, understanding that his relationship to the accused would compromise his ability to render impartial judgment. But his presence served as a reminder of the bonds of blood and loyalty that had shaped both brothers' choices throughout their lives. Brienne of Tarth stood as the primary witness for Jaime's character, her testimony carrying weight not just because of her position as Lord Commander, but because of the unique relationship she had developed with the man who had once been her captor. The oath she had sworn to Catelyn Stark had bound her to protect Jaime, but her defense of him now came from personal knowledge of his capacity for honor. "I have served beside Sir Jaime in battle," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembly. "I have seen him risk his life to protect the innocent, have watched him choose duty over personal advantage time and again. The man who stands before you today is not the same person who earned the name Kingslayer decades ago." The testimony that followed painted a complex picture of a man who had spent his adult life trying to balance competing loyalties and obligations. Witnesses spoke of moments when Jaime had shown mercy to defeated enemies, when he had protected civilians during the sack of King's Landing, when he had chosen honor over expedience even when it cost him personally. But the prosecution, led by representatives of houses that had suffered under Lannister rule, presented their own evidence of Jaime's crimes and failures. The attempt on Bran Stark's life was discussed in detail, along with his role in the conflicts that had torn the Seven Kingdoms apart. The portrait that emerged was of a man capable of both great nobility and terrible cruelty, depending on the circumstances and the pressures he faced. Sam Tarly, serving in his capacity as Grand Maester, provided historical context for the charges against Jaime, noting that the title Kingslayer had been earned not through treachery, but through an act that had saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The killing of Aerys Targaryen had prevented the wildfire destruction of King's Landing, making Jaime a hero even as it branded him a traitor to his knightly vows. The same man who killed a king to save innocent lives recently killed a queen for the same purpose, Sam observed. The consistency of motive suggests that Ser Jaime's actions have been guided by moral principles rather than mere opportunism. The most dramatic moment in the proceedings came when Bran Stark was called to testify about the attempt on his life that had set so many tragic events in motion. The Three-Eyed Raven's unique perspective on time and causation provided insights that went beyond conventional understanding of guilt and responsibility. "The boy who was pushed from that tower died long before his body stopped breathing," Bran said, his pale eyes seeming to look through Jaime rather than at him. "The man who emerges from this trial will be someone different from both the knight who committed that crime and the person who has struggled with its consequences ever since." The philosophical complexity of Bran's testimony reflected the broader questions that the trial raised about the nature of identity and moral responsibility. Were people defined by their worst moments or by their capacity for growth and change? Could genuine redemption erase the harm caused by past actions, or did justice require punishment regardless of subsequent transformation? Jaime himself spoke in his own defense with a humility that would have been foreign to the arrogant young knight who had first donned the white cloak of the King's Guard. His words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, the understanding that came from having faced the consequences of his choices and found them wanting. "I have spent my life trying to serve honor and love simultaneously," he said, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what was at stake. "I learned too late that sometimes these loyalties conflict, that choices must be made between competing goods. I cannot undo the harm I have caused, but I can dedicate whatever time remains to me to preventing similar harm in the future." The testimony of small folk who had been affected by Jaime's actions provided perhaps the most powerful evidence for both prosecution and defense. Some spoke of cruelties they had witnessed or experienced, of the arrogance and contempt that had characterized the Lannister approach to governance. Others described moments of unexpected kindness, times when Jaime had used his position to protect those who had no other defender. A particular moving testimony came from a woman whose family had been killed during the sack of King's Landing, but who had been personally saved by Jaime's intervention. Her words carried the complexity of someone who had reason to hate but had chosen forgiveness instead. "He cannot bring back my husband or my children," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But he kept me from joining them that day, and he has spent years trying to make amends for what happened. Punishment will not heal my wounds, but mercy might prevent others from suffering as I have suffered." The legal arguments that followed explored the tension between individual accountability and societal healing. Some argued that crimes of Jaime's magnitude required severe punishment regardless of subsequent redemption, that justice demanded consequences proportionate to harm caused. Others contended that the greatest service Jaime could provide would be to continue using his skills and experience in service of the new order. Davos Seaworth, speaking from his position as master of ships, provided practical perspective on the question of Jaime's future role. "The realm needs experienced leaders who understand both the costs of conflict and the requirements of peace," he observed. Sir Jaime's knowledge of warfare and politics could serve the common good if properly directed. The debate continued for hours, with various perspectives explored and evaluated. The assembly that had gathered to witness the trial represented a cross-section of Westerosi society, from great lords to common citizens, all interested in how the new government would balance the demands of justice with the needs of reconciliation. As the proceedings drew toward a conclusion, Jon rose to deliver the judgment that everyone had been waiting to hear. His words would establish important precedents for how the realm would treat those who sought redemption after committing serious crimes. "Jaime Lannister," he began, his voice carrying the authority of his office and the weight of personal witness. "You stand before this court having committed grave crimes against individuals and against the realm. The harm you have caused cannot be undone, and the pain you have inflicted cannot be erased." The assembled crowd held its breath, understanding that the next words would determine not just Jaime's fate, but the character of the justice system being established. "However," Jon continued, "you have also demonstrated a capacity for growth and moral courage that suggests genuine transformation. Your actions in preventing the wildfire catastrophe saved hundreds of thousands of lives, proving that the man you have become is different from the man who committed past crimes." The judgment that followed was complex and nuanced, reflecting the unprecedented nature of the case. Jaime would be stripped of his remaining titles and properties, acknowledging the seriousness of his crimes, but he would also be offered the opportunity to serve the realm in a capacity that would allow him to make amends through constructive action rather than mere suffering. "You will serve as Knight Protector of the Innocent," Jon declared, creating a new position tailored specifically to Jaime's unique combination of skills and need for redemption. "Your duty will be to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to serve justice without regard for rank or status, and to demonstrate through your actions that honor can be reclaimed even by those who have lost it." The sentence was both punishment and opportunity, acknowledging the reality of past crimes while creating space for future service. It represented the kind of restorative justice that the new government sought to establish, focused on healing rather than mere retribution. Jaime accepted the judgment with visible relief and determination, understanding that he had been given something precious and rare, a second chance to define his legacy through service rather than through the mistakes of his past. The Golden Knight was gone, replaced by someone simpler but more authentic, someone who understood that true honor came not from titles or recognition, but from the willingness to sacrifice for others. The trial of Jaime Lannister was concluded, but its implications would echo throughout the realm for generations to come. Chapter 38: The Scholar's Tale. The Great Library of King's Landing had been one of the few structures to survive the wildfire crisis relatively intact, its stone walls and careful construction protecting centuries of accumulated knowledge from the flames that had consumed so much of the Red Keep. Sam Tarly stood among the towering shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, his chains of office glinting in the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. The Grand Maester had transformed this ancient repository of learning into something far more ambitious than a mere collection of books and scrolls. The chamber that served as Sam's private study had become the heart of an unprecedented scholarly enterprise, one that would preserve not just the written records of recent events, but the deeper truths about human nature and the possibilities for positive change that those events had revealed. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with the movements of armies and the rise and fall of kingdoms, but also annotated with notes about the social and economic transformations that had accompanied political upheaval. Gilly worked beside him with the quiet efficiency that had marked their partnership since their early days at Castle Black. The wildling woman who had once been trapped by the brutal customs of her people had become an invaluable collaborator in the great work of chronicling their age. Her perspective as someone who had experienced both the old ways and the new provided insights that purely academic analysis could never achieve. The testimonies from the freed slaves are particularly illuminating, she said, organizing a collection of accounts that had arrived from Essos documenting the transformation of Slavers Bay. They speak not just of political liberation but of psychological transformation, of learning to see themselves as people worthy of dignity and respect rather than as property to be bought and sold. The project that consumed their days and many of their nights went far beyond traditional historical chronicling. Sam understood that future generations would need more than just a record of events. They would need to understand the principles and processes that had made positive change possible. The work he was creating would serve as both historical record and practical guide for those who sought to continue the transformation that had begun. Little Sam played quietly in the corner of the study, his presence serving as a daily reminder of what was at stake in their scholarly endeavors. The child who had once faced death simply because of the circumstances of his birth now lived in a world where such arbitrary cruelty was increasingly rare. The future that Sam and Gilly were documenting was one that their son would inherit and hopefully improve upon. The title page of the great work bore simple words that reflected both its scope and its purpose. A Song of Ice and Fire, the true history of the transformation of the known world. But the subtitle revealed the deeper ambition that drove the project, a guide for future generations seeking to build justice upon the foundations of mercy. The chapters that were taking shape covered not just the major battles and political negotiations, but the smaller moments of human connection that had made transformation possible. Sam wrote about the friendship between Jon and Samwell that had begun at Castle Black, about the loyalty between Daenerys and Missandei that had transcended the boundaries of former slave and former queen, about the love between Grey Worm and Missandei that had proven stronger than the conditioning designed to eliminate all human emotion. The personal relationships matter as much as the political ones, Sam explained to Gilly, as they worked through a particularly complex section dealing with the alliance between ice and fire. History tends to focus on kings and queens, on battles and treaties, but the real changes happen when individual people choose to see each other as fully human rather than as enemies or obstacles. The research required for such a comprehensive work had led Sam to correspond with scholars and witnesses across the known world. Ravens arrived daily carrying accounts from participants in the great events, while ships brought longer documents and artifacts that provided material evidence for the transformations being documented. The network of knowledge that was emerging represented a collaborative approach to scholarship that had never before been attempted. Maester Wulkan had sent detailed accounts of the transformation of the North under Sansa's rule, documenting the practical implementation of policies that balanced tradition with innovation. His meticulous record-keeping provided concrete examples of how abstract principles of governance could be translated into improved conditions for ordinary people. From Old Town came philosophical treatises from the Citadel's most learned maesters, analyzing the theoretical implications of the political changes that were reshaping their world. Some were skeptical of the new approaches to governance, arguing that human nature made such idealistic experiments ultimately doomed to failure. Others saw in recent events the validation of principles that had been discussed in academic circles for centuries but never tested in practice. The accounts from Essos were particularly valuable, providing perspectives from people who had experienced the liberation campaigns firsthand. Former slaves described not just the physical realities of their transformed circumstances, but the psychological journey from resignation to hope to active participation in building better societies. One particularly moving testimony came from a woman who had been born into slavery in Marine, but was now serving as a member of the city's governing council. "I spent the first 30 years of my life believing that suffering was simply the natural condition of people like me," she wrote. "The Dragon Queen taught us that we could choose our own fate, but more importantly, she taught us that we were worthy of making that choice." The military aspects of the recent conflicts were documented with careful attention to the tactical innovations that had made victory possible, but Sam was equally interested in the strategic thinking that had guided the transformation from conquest to governance, the delicate process of turning military victory into lasting political change. The section dealing with the dragons represented one of the most challenging aspects of the project. How could purely human language capture the reality of creatures that seemed to bridge the gap between the natural and the supernatural? Sam approached the challenge by focusing not just on their physical capabilities, but on their symbolic significance and their relationship with their human partners. "Dragons are not merely weapons," he wrote in one of his more philosophical passages. "They are living symbols of the power that comes from the union of opposing forces. Fire and flesh, ancient wisdom and contemporary need, individual will and collective purpose. They represent the possibility of transcending the limitations that have historically constrained human achievement." The economic analysis that formed another crucial component of the work drew heavily on correspondence with merchants and administrators from across both continents. The abolition of slavery had disrupted traditional trade networks, but it had also created new opportunities for commerce based on free labor and voluntary exchange. The data suggested that the economic benefits of liberation far outweighed the costs, both in terms of raw productivity and in the innovation that came from allowing human creativity to flourish. As the months passed, the scope of the project continued to expand. What had begun as a straightforward historical chronicle was becoming something more ambitious, a comprehensive analysis of how societies could transform themselves through the application of principles based on human dignity and mutual respect. The correspondence with Daenerys in Essos provided ongoing updates on the progress of the Eastern Campaign, but it also contributed to the philosophical dimensions of the work. The Dragon Queen's letters revealed someone who was continuing to evolve in her understanding of leadership and power, someone who was learning to balance the demands of military necessity with the requirements of moral governance. "The enemy we face in Essos is not just the remnants of the slave masters," she wrote in one particularly insightful message. It is the idea that some people are naturally meant to dominate others, that inequality is not a problem to be solved but a fact to be accepted. Every victory we win here is a victory for human dignity everywhere. The reports from the ongoing conflict were sobering, but not discouraging. The Eastern powers had indeed proven more formidable than initially anticipated, possessing capabilities that stretched conventional military thinking. But the freed slaves and their allies were fighting with a determination that seemed to grow stronger with each challenge they faced. John's letters from King's Landing provided the other half of the great experiment in transformative governance. His experiences in rebuilding Westeros while maintaining support for the Eastern Campaign revealed both the possibilities and the limitations of trying to rule according to moral principles in a world still largely governed by more traditional approaches to power. Every day brings choices between the expedient and the right. He wrote in one message that Sam found particularly illuminating. The temptation is always to choose what works in the short term. But we have learned that sustainable solutions require the patience to do what is right, even when it is difficult. The children's section of the great work represented Sam's attempt to ensure that future generations would understand not just what had happened, but why it mattered. Simple stories illustrated complex principles, while engaging narratives made abstract concepts accessible to young minds that would someday inherit responsibility for continuing the transformation. Little Sam had begun to contribute to this aspect of the project, his questions and observations providing insights into how children processed the moral complexities of the adult world. His innocent queries often revealed assumptions and contradictions that more sophisticated analysis might miss. As the great work neared completion of its first major section, Sam reflected on the magnitude of what he was attempting to accomplish. This was more than scholarship. It was an act of faith in the possibility of human improvement, a declaration that the suffering and struggle of recent years had meaning that transcended immediate political victories. The library around him had become more than a repository of knowledge. It was a workshop for the future, a place where the tools were being forged that future generations would use to continue building the more just world that so many had died to make possible. The Song of Ice and Fire was being written in ink and parchment, but its true power lay in its capacity to inspire others to add their own verses to the great ballad of human progress. The great library of King's Landing had fallen silent as Sam Tarly worked late into the night, his scholarly dedication driving him to complete another section of the chronicle that would preserve their age for posterity. The candles burned low on his desk as he carefully transcribed the latest reports from both the Eastern Campaign and the ongoing reconstruction efforts throughout Westeros. Everything seemed to be progressing according to plan, the great experiment in transformative governance showing promise despite the challenges that remained. But as Sam reached for fresh parchment to begin a new chapter, his attention was caught by an unusual disturbance outside the library's tall windows. The night sky, which should have been dark except for stars, and the occasional patrol dragon, was lit by an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from multiple points on the horizon. Rising from his chair, Sam approached the window with growing concern. What he saw there sent ice through his veins and made him question whether his eyes were deceiving him. Ships filled the harbor as far as the eye could see, but these were not the familiar vessels of the royal fleet or the merchant traders who regularly visited the capital. The ships bore sails that seemed to glow with their own inner light, their hulls carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They moved through the water without wind and without oars, their passage creating patterns in the waves that defied everything Sam knew about maritime navigation. Most disturbing of all, they made no sound, their arrival as silent as death itself. From his position in the library tower, Sam could see that the mysterious fleet surrounded not just King's Landing, but extended as far as the horizon in every direction. This was not a naval force, but an armada of unprecedented size, carrying implications that his scholarly mind struggled to process. A raven arrived at his window as he watched its black feathers seeming to absorb the strange light from the ships below. The message it carried bore the seal of Dragonstone. But the words written on the parchment were unlike anything in John's usual correspondence. The stars have changed their patterns. The three-eyed raven sees what was hidden. They come not from the east, but from beneath. The deep places of the world have opened, and what was thought lost has returned. Trust nothing that seems familiar. The game was never about thrones. The message was signed, not with John's name, but with a symbol that Sam recognized from the oldest texts in the library's collection, a mark that predated not just the Targaryen conquest, but the very foundation of the Seven Kingdoms themselves. As Sam struggled to understand the implications of what he was reading, the light from the ships began to change. The glow that had seemed merely unsettling became something actively malevolent, pulsing with rhythms that seemed designed to disturb human perception. Looking directly at it caused waves of nausea and disorientation that suggested this was no ordinary illumination. Through his bond with the castle's ravens, Sam began to receive fragmentary messages from across the realm. Old Town reported similar ships appearing in their harbor. White Harbor sent word of vessels that seemed to rise from the depths of the sea itself. Even Winterfell, far inland, reported strange lights moving across the landscape like searching eyes. The most disturbing message came from a source Sam had never expected to hear from again. A raven arrived bearing the seal of the Night's Watch. Impossible though it seemed, given that the wall had fallen and the watch disbanded. But the words it carried were even more impossible to believe. The long night was only the beginning. What we fought was merely the vanguard of something far older and more terrible. The true enemy slept beneath ice and stone, waiting for the moment when the barriers between worlds grew thin. That moment has come. The dead were just their servants. Now the masters have awakened. Sam's hands shook as he read the message, his scholarly mind rejecting implications that challenged everything he thought he understood about their world. The Night King had been defeated, the army of the dead destroyed, the threat from beyond the wall ended forever. How could there be something worse still waiting in the shadows? But as he looked out at the silent armada that had appeared from nowhere, as he felt the wrongness in the air that seemed to make reality itself uncertain, Sam began to understand that their victory over the dead had been incomplete. They had won a battle, perhaps even a war, but the conflict itself was far from over. A new sound reached him then, cutting through the unnatural silence that surrounded the mysterious ships. It was singing, but not in any language he recognized. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and utterly alien, seeming to come from the depths of the earth itself rather than from human throats. The song spoke of cities beneath the waves, of civilizations that had flourished when the world was young, of powers that had been sleeping for millennia but were now stirring to reclaim what had once been theirs. It was a song of return, of restoration, of the end of the brief age when humanity had imagined itself the masters of their own fate. As Sam listened, he began to understand that everything they had accomplished, all the progress toward justice and freedom that had defined recent years, had been permitted to happen for reasons that had nothing to do with human agency. They had been allowed to build their new world, but only because those who truly controlled the deeper patterns of reality had been content to wait and watch. Now the waiting was over. The library around him began to change as the alien song continued, books rearranging themselves on shelves, words shifting on pages, knowledge itself becoming unreliable and mutable. The careful chronicle he had been writing of their age was transforming before his eyes, revealing hidden meanings and darker truths that had been concealed beneath the surface of events. The great work that was to have been titled A Song of Ice and Fire now bore a different name, The Brief Rebellion of the Surface Dwellers. The chapters he had written about triumph and transformation revealed themselves as mere preface to a larger story about the futility of human ambition when measured against truly cosmic forces. Through the window, Sam could see that the ships were beginning to disgorge their passengers, But these were not soldiers or sailors in any conventional sense. They were something else entirely, shapes that moved like liquid shadow and seemed to exist only partially in the world that humans perceived as reality. A final raven arrived as the singing reached crescendo, its message bearing the seal of Daenerys in Essos. But the words it carried were not in her hand, and the message it brought was not meant for human eyes. The Dragon Queen sends word from the deep places where she now serves. The campaign in the East was successful beyond all expectation. The ancient alliances have been renewed. The true children of Valyria have returned to collect what was always rightfully theirs. Tell the usurper kings of Westeros that their reign is ended. The age of humanity is over. The age of the deep gods has begun. As Sam read these words, he felt his understanding of everything they had fought for begin to crumble. The liberation of slaves, the transformation of governance, the hope for a better future, all of it had been an illusion, a dream permitted by forces so vast and ancient that human concepts of good and evil were meaningless to them. The song from the ships reached its climax, and reality itself seemed to shiver in response. Sam dropped the message as his vision blurred, the library around him fading into something else entirely. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the symbol that now marked every page of his chronicle, a mark that predated human civilization and would outlast its ending. The Game of Thrones was over, but the players had never been human at all.